Hi everyone, and welcome to the March edition of CyberSciBar. As you are all abundantly aware at this point, we are just over a year into the coronavirus pandemic, and just over a year into sort of living and working in this virtual realm. So it's so strange to think, particularly for us, just 12 months ago, that every event we had hosted up until then was all done in person. And then pretty much overnight, like most other people, we had to switch everything we did to online events, which is very odd indeed. But here we are 12 months later, and we're still managing to keep going. We're still sort of doing what we came here to do. And I think most importantly, we are still, luckily, attracting wonderful audience members like yourselves that rock up every now and again to hear about what we have to say. So thank you for that. For anyone out there that is new to our events, hi and welcome. I'm Nicola. I organise all of the regular events for Palace of Science, and we are a not-for-profit organisation based in Newcastle upon Tyne, and we showcase the science and research happening in the northeast of England. So we host a range of events just like this one throughout the year. Behind the scenes, the Palace team, we are all volunteers. So some of us are scientists, some of us are science enthusiasts, but all of us, to some extent or another, are aware that there is a wealth of science and research happening in the Northeast, and we're here to provide a platform and an opportunity to share that with people that want to learn more about it. So tonight's event, CyberSciBar, this happens every month. Every month we get a scientist or researcher to talk about the work that they do with us. Every month it's a different speaker, and it's usually on a totally different topic, so there's hopefully something for everyone. It's a really informal event, so before the plague hit, we usually hosted in a bar or a pub, so it gave everyone an opportunity to enjoy a beer together, discuss some science, and really allow people in the audience to ask an expert about their work and get to learn a bit about what they do. So obviously switching to an online event, that social aspect is a little bit reduced, but we certainly do still encourage it. So you'll see on Twitch there is a chat bar. We'd love you to use it. If you want to say hi, tell us where you're watching from, or if you have any questions for myself or tonight's speaker, then please do put them into the chat bar, and we will happily answer them. So if you haven't been to a CyberSciBar before, the talk tonight will last about 30 minutes, and then we will take a 5-minute break. It'll allow you to digest all of the wonderful information you're about to hear, and also take part in the quiz I put together earlier. And then we'll come back after that 5-minute break for a question and answer session. So if you do have any questions at any point during the talk, just stick them in the chat bar and we will happily answer them. So now you know how it's going to work. I think we'll pretty much get started. So tonight's talk, I've been really looking forward to it, not just because it's such an interesting topic, and I think it's one that is becoming much more relevant in the sort of public sphere. But on a personal note, it's also because tonight's speaker, Dr. Rike Bolam, I actually work alongside her during the day. So Rike is a research associate in the Modelling, Evidence and Policy group at Newcastle University. It's quite a big group. There's lots of really interesting science going on. If you don't follow them on Twitter, you should. It's at molevpol. And I asked Rike to speak to us tonight about some of the work she does on biodiversity policy and species conservation. So I'm very thankful that she agreed to take part. I think that's everything from me. So if you would like to give a warm virtual welcome to Dr. Rike Bolam.
Thanks, Nicola, and thank you for inviting me to speak. So as Nicola said, I'm in the Modelling, Evidence and Policy group, and I think you can actually see the Twitter link on the first slide, which I hope you can all see now. I'm just going to assume that you can. Okay, so I'm going to talk about global policies for species conservation to prevent future extinctions. And I will probably end up sort of saying biodiversity conservation and species conservation slightly interchangeably, but actually it's not quite the same thing. So when we talk about biodiversity, we normally talk about species, but also genes and ecosystems. But really, I'm just talking about species. So yeah, what are these global policies for species conservation? There are kind of two main ones really to be aware of. And the first one is part of the Sustainable Development Goals. So these goals have been agreed by the UN in 2015, and they all kind of come to an end in 2030. And in particular, their goal 15 is about life on land, and there is a target within that which says that countries should prevent extinctions of species. But this target and also the other targets in Goal 15 really come from a different UN convention, the Convention on Biological Diversity. And this convention has another set of targets, and those targets came to an end last year. And there are now discussions about what will follow on from these targets, and there were 20 of them. But really, they should have been agreed last year, but because of the pandemic, the time plan slightly changed. I'm sorry, I hope you cannot hear my puppy barking in the background. She is barking, but hopefully you can't hear that. It's just distracting me a little bit. So I've mentioned these 20 targets, and because they came to an end last year, there was a lot of interest in trying to identify how many of them have been achieved. And unfortunately, it was found that none of these 20 targets have been achieved, and only 6 of them were partially achieved. And that was kind of the purpose of this report called Global Biodiversity Outlook 5, which was put together by the Convention on Biological Diversity. So that's not very good. And when we think about these 20 targets, so I've mentioned species, and species are, well, the content of one of the targets, but there are also other things in there about stopping forest loss, for example, stopping pollution, which can impact species or invasive species. And so there are other things in there as well. But let's focus on species because that's really the topic for tonight. The target on species had not been met, and basically that means some species have gone extinct over that time frame of these targets. So there are all kinds of examples, really. The Chinese paddlefish, for example, 8 bird species, mainly in South America, or the Pipistrelle Island bat species. There was only 1 individual of that species left. And the scientists who kept monitoring this species eventually couldn't find that individual anymore, so they declared it extinct. And declaring species extinct is not really straightforward because you could go and survey for a species quite a lot and you might not find it, but of course that doesn't necessarily mean it's gone extinct. It just means you haven't found it on those occasions. So it can take some time to really know when a species has gone extinct, and often there are some kind of time lags. After so many years of not finding it, we might say, okay, the species has gone extinct. But the question is, so we've got these targets, they haven't been met, but have we actually done something positive? So would there have been more species that would have gone extinct if it hadn't been for conservation action? So I'm going to try to answer that question, at least to some extent. So how many extinctions have we prevented, and also how then does that compare to actual extinctions? And I'm only going to focus on 2 taxonomic groups, on birds and mammals, and that's because we know a lot more about these groups than many other species groups. But really, it's just a drop in the ocean, and there are many, many more species, and these haven't been part of the study that I'm going to talk about now. And so when we started thinking about this project, we basically narrowed down the species list of all bird and mammal species. So there are about 17,000 of those. And first of all, we just wanted to look at those species that are actually fairly close to extinction or have been over the time period of these targets, which is just a small subset really, considering. And once we had identified those species that are threatened or have been threatened, we then also needed to identify whether actually any conservation actions have taken place for these species that might have prevented their extinction. So we went sort of from 17,000 to 630 and then to 81 species, where we created quite detailed accounts with a lot of information. And a lot of that actually comes from the Iucn Red List, which is often the sort of basis for a lot of the work that I do. The Iucn Red List is basically a way to assess the probability that a species might go extinct, and there are different categories. So if a species is on the red list, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's threatened. It could be a species of least concern, that means it's not threatened, or it could be one of the threatened categories. And apart from this kind of category that each species gets, there is also lots of other information on population sizes and trends and the threats and also the conservation actions that have taken place for the species. So it's a really useful resource for this sort of project. And so essentially we went through these species accounts, and that's how we narrowed down our list. And then we had these species accounts with a lot of detail of these 81 species, and we asked a group of experts what the probability is that conservation action prevented extinction. We had about 30 experts. They rated each of these species individually and without talking to anyone else. And then we had a discussion, so people could sort of say what they kind of thought. And then again, everyone would rate again every species. So maybe there was some new information during that chat. And then I combined all of that information and calculated sort of the average values of this percentage. So I'm going to talk you through a few of these species just to give you a bit of an idea what this sort of looks like in practice. So I'm going to start with the Puerto Rican Amazon. So this is a very bonny species of parrot, lives only on Puerto Rico, only on one island, and we gave that a very high probability that conservation action prevented their extinction. And that's because there used to be only one population in one part of Puerto Rico, and they've sort of faced various threats to do with extreme weather, but also predation. And so there was only this one population, and then through conservation action, people translocated some of them into a different part of the island. And in the end, there were two populations that were successfully breeding. And then a hurricane wiped out the original population of the Puerto Rican Amazon, so that only that population that had been translocated was left. And so we were pretty sure without conservation action, that species would have gone extinct. So that had a very high score. The next species is a little bit more complicated, and as a result, I guess it has a slightly lower score. So this is the Iberian Lynx. So you can find the species mainly in the south of Spain, but now also in some other parts of Spain and also in Portugal. And the Iberian Lynx really has faced quite a range of threats. Probably the key one being the reduction in their prey source. So they mainly feed on rabbits, and the rabbits have been suffering from a virus, and so the rabbit population has crashed, and as a result, the Iberian lynx population also crashed very dramatically between the 1980s and the 1990s. But they also suffer from other threats. So a lot of the habitats are disconnected, and there aren't really any good corridors in between, or there might be lots of roads, so they might be killed on the roads. And so the populations are very isolated, and there isn't a lot of gene flow in between them. And so the conservation actions have really focused on that kind of thing. So again, translocating these cats to mix up the gene pool a little bit, and to create more corridors, and also, I guess, to try and increase the prey population. And so the species has been recovering, but the sort of cause and effect is not as obvious, I guess, as it is with the Puerto Rican Amazon. And the third example I've got is the Chinese crested tern. So this is a species that nests on the coastlines of China and is mainly threatened by people collecting their eggs and, well, presumably to eat them. And that's really caused quite dramatic declines in the species. And once that was realized, lots of patrols were taking place, and there were fines, and that basically stopped people from collecting the eggs, and the population increased once again. But what we hadn't realized initially was that there was actually a very small population of this species living on an island that no one had known about. And so no one had done any conservation action to protect it. And so we gave this species quite a low score, because even without all of these conservation actions that were very successful, the species would probably have survived on this little island anyway. And so you can sort of see you need quite a lot of information to be able to make these assessments, which is why we're focused on birds and mammals. I think for some of the other species groups, that would be very difficult to do. But that gives you sort of a bit of a taste for some of these sorts of things, and how we've come up with the decisions that we've made. And overall, then, we found since '93, so when the convention came into force, that 21 to 32 bird extinctions and 7 to 16 mammal extinctions have been prevented. And this range in these numbers really reflects our certainty. So the 21 birds and 7 mammals are those species with a probability above 90%, and 32 birds and 16 mammals are those with a probability above 50%. So you can kind of see we try to be careful in our assessment, and that's why those ranges are displayed there. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the threats that these species face more generally, and the actions that have taken place. So starting with the birds. So you can see on this map the number of species per country that have been prevented from going extinct. We don't normally say save, because a lot of these species are still threatened. They are not necessarily saved. And I think that's worth pointing out. Probably unsurprisingly, in South America, there are quite a few, particularly in Brazil. And South America has the highest number of bird species in the world. So I guess that's kind of unsurprising. And often there, the threat is to do with habitat loss. And if that can be stopped, often the species can recover. But there are also quite a few bird species on islands, and often that's because they've been threatened by an invasive species. And then if you can remove that invasive species, the bird population can recover. So you see a lot of these little circles, and those are all species on islands. So you get sort of an overview of some of these birds and the kind of key threats. For mammals, it looks a little bit different. So there's quite a few in China, and there's actually none in South America. And the threats to mammals are slightly different as well. So one of the key threats we found was that things like poaching was detrimental to these, and as a result, also any kind of activity that stops that sort of thing from happening has been most effective. So things like better legislation or stricter protection in protected areas and things like that. So there is a bit of a difference between the two groups, between birds and mammals. So these numbers, if we sometimes hear the sort of news about biodiversity, it doesn't sound like all that much. I mean, maybe, up to 50 species roughly their extinction has been prevented, which doesn't sound very much if you put it into the context of, these news headlines about 1 million species are at risk of extinction. But of course, we've had a much smaller subset of species to start with. And also we need to think about how many species did actually go extinct over that same time frame. So if we put it into that context, we found that the extinction rates actually would have been 3 to 4 times greater without conservation action. And so I think that is quite a positive message. We really have made quite a big difference. As I said, these species aren't necessarily saved, but we have been able to show that for a small group of species, we really can make a difference. And I think that's really nice. And when we published the paper to go with this, there was quite a lot of interest. And I think because especially last year, there was so much bad news going around, and having something positive was just great for everyone. But as I mentioned, these numbers are still relatively small, and this is all species-specific sort of things that are happening. And also this set of targets that's come to an end last year, and the new set of targets that's being discussed now, we really need to think a little bit broader. We can't just sort of think about individual species and what we can do for them. We need to think about, what ultimately are the drivers behind all of this. And so that's what we've been trying to do. Oh yes, this is a photo from a long time ago when we were all still allowed to travel, where we presented some of these findings to the conference on biodiversity. And yeah, we'll see what this next set of targets is going to look like. As I said, they're being discussed now, and I'm going to show you what is sort of currently being proposed to address the threats to species. And maybe just to say that essentially the governments that are signatories to the convention, they agree this, but other organizations try to have an input. And so I've been going to some of these meetings as part of Iucn to see what can be done for species and to make sure that these targets can be kind of ambitious, I guess, because we do need to make a difference, but also realistic on what can actually be done to help countries try to stop the loss of species. And so currently there are some targets being proposed that are designed to tackle the biggest threats to species. And I'm going to talk quickly about these and then tell you a bit more about some of the work we've been doing about these targets. So the first two actually are about ecosystems and protected areas, and often that seems to be what gets the most attention, and there is a lot of thought about how much land should be protected. And I don't know, maybe some of you have come across some of this. So some people say half of the planet should be protected area, and some people say 30%, and some people say it doesn't matter as long as the areas are actually well managed, which is sometimes a bit of a struggle. But anyway, so there are different discussions around that. I'm going to skip target 3 for the moment, but then the other targets, so target 4 is about harvesting and trade, which is a key threat to species. Then we have one on invasive species, one on pollution, and also one on climate change. Climate change is a bit of a funny one with species. We obviously know that some species are threatened by climate change, but it can be quite difficult to prove that. And of course, as the climate is changing more, it's also likely that more species will be threatened by climate change. So climate change is probably a bit of an underestimated threat, as I think, for species from the knowledge that we have. And so in the first iteration of these proposed targets that haven't been agreed yet, that was sort of that was it. And then some people pointed out that really we need a target for species and to manage their recovery, which is this target 3, which is sort of has been slotted in later on in the process. And I think, as we've seen from what I showed you earlier, to protect all species from extinction, for some species we will need individual species action. And so that's kind of what target 3 is about, if it is going to be in this final proposal. And so we've been doing some work to try and quantify how important these different targets are, and also why we think target 3 is really crucial for this new framework. So I'm going to show you a figure now, which is hopefully not too complicated. I'll talk you through it. So on the left-hand side, we have the different threats to species. So we have things like biological resource use. That can be things like hunting, but also logging. So it can be both affecting animals, but also can affect plants and therefore the habitat, which can have wider reaching consequences, I guess, if you remove the forest, and obviously the species that live there go with it. Also agriculture and aquaculture, again, that's mainly causing habitat loss. So that's a key threat. And then other still important threats, but I guess less important than those ones. And then we've tried to match those different threats to the targets on the right-hand side. So those are the targets that I've just talked you through, to see how many species would benefit from these different targets. And clearly target 1 and 2 are the most important ones, because over 6,000 species would benefit from them. And then we get sort of, slightly lower numbers for the other targets. But crucially for target 3, for managing species for recovery. It's nearly 3,000 species, and that's kind of for two reasons, really. So some of these threats that are not so great are not really addressed by any of the other targets because they might not be affecting so many species, so there isn't a specific target. But they could still be captured in this target 3. But also some species might need additional actions because even if you removed all of the threats to them, the populations might already be so depleted that they wouldn't be able to recover. So we talked about the Iberian Lynx earlier on. So all of the habitat loss there, that's already happened. Even if you stopped any more habitat loss from happening, the species might still not be able to link in between the different populations and things like that. So you might need this additional action. And I should say as well, this work is about a much bigger group of species, not just birds and mammals, but actually all species groups that have been fully assessed on the Red List. So there's about, over 100,000 species now on the Red List, but some taxonomic groups have been fully assessed. And we included all of those, and there was about 30,000 species, and it's other than birds and mammals, there are some other vertebrate groups. There are also some plant and insect groups, and some of the groups are freshwater groups, and so on. So it's much more representative. So anyway, so we found basically target 3 is really important, and the countries should really retain that target if they want to make progress towards preventing extinctions from happening. And then we also mapped this, so you can see how many countries would, or how many species per country there are that would need these additional actions from target 3. And some countries, particularly Australia and Indonesia, have an awful lot of these, over 300. So that is a lot of work for those countries to actually be able to do these individual actions. And I think that kind of really leads me to my next point, which is kind of both how do you actually do this in practice, but also how do you kind of make it fair? Because we might not have as many species in the UK where we need individual actions, but we might still be responsible for some of the habitat loss, for example, in tropical countries. So often what happens is you get habitat loss, forest is being chopped down for various reasons, maybe to produce soybeans that are then fed to livestock that we then eat. So these sort of global supply chains have a big impact. And of course, we can't just say, well, all of these species, this is, Indonesia's problem, for example, because once an extinction has happened, that's it. We can't get that species back. So it's everyone's responsibility, really. But yeah, how can we do something that is kind of fair globally? And I've taken this last figure from Global Biodiversity Outlook 5. So this is, again, this report that assessed progress towards the last set of targets. And it also has a section on how we can make progress in the future. And I think this figure really quite nicely summarizes what I've talked about today, but also the additional things that really we need to be thinking about. So it starts off at the bottom with conservation and restoration. Then there is climate change action, which of course can often be the same kind of thing. If you protect forest for species, then you can also mitigate climate change with that, I guess. Then we have reducing other drivers. So I was talking about pollution earlier and invasive species, and so it's things like that. But really, we need to then think about what the drivers are of some of these things, like habitat loss. And that's where sustainable production and reduced consumption come into play. So we might not think about these things as critical for biodiversity, but for example, if we can reduce food waste, then we would see less habitat loss, and that would essentially benefit biodiversity. And of course, it would also benefit your pocket if you waste less food. And so there is a lot of research now on these sorts of links, the global supply chains, but also what can actually be done, not just in the countries with high rates of biodiversity and also biodiversity loss, but also in the other countries that might actually be driving some of these things. So I think it's a really interesting topic because it's so connected, and I think sometimes you wouldn't think about some of these connections. But also, I think it's nice because we can sort of show that there are things that can be done, and it is possible, well, both to save or, well, prevent the extinction of individual species, but also that there are much wider actions that can be done. Essentially, that would benefit biodiversity, but also the climate, and essentially everyone with that. So if we can implement some of these things, which is of course going to be the big challenge, then that would be excellent. So let's work on that. And that's really all I have for you this evening. Thank you very much for listening. And yeah, if you have any questions, I'll be here for a while and happy to answer any of them. Thank you.
Thank you, Rike. That was great. Obviously, I'm a bit familiar with the work that you do, but it's always really interesting to get a more in-depth look at the work you've carried out. So I'm sure our audience have lots of questions about what you've discussed. I know I do. So we're going to take a 5-minute break now to allow you all to digest that information and come up with any questions you have. Of course, just stick them in the chat and we will pose them to Rike shortly. In case anyone has to rush off, I will just give you a brief overview of a couple of events that we have coming up. So our next CyberSciBar next month in April, it's on the 21st of April, and it is by Chris Greenwell. He's a professor in geochemistry at Durham University. I just found out about his talk this week and it sounds very ambitious. So he's giving what sounds like a short summary of the origins of life on Earth, sort of from rocks up to animals, which I think is a hell of an ask for 30 minutes. So I'm certainly intrigued about that one. So join us on Wednesday, the 21st of April to hear about that. Then in May, we have another researcher from Newcastle University. She is the creator of a new type of photovoltaic technology. It's the most efficient and sustainable to date, and it is used to power what she's describing as zombie devices. So the Internet of Things, these devices capable of machine learning. So that certainly sounds very intriguing as well. So that is on the Wednesday, the 19th of May. Both of these will be streamed on Twitch because I doubt, unfortunately, we'll be holding in-person events before then. But you never know. But yeah, probably tune in on Twitch to catch those. If you know anyone that would have enjoyed tonight's talk that didn't have time to watch it this evening, Rike has very kindly agreed to let us film the talk, and we will be adding this to the Palace of Science YouTube channel in a couple of days, so you can watch it again and again to your heart's content. And of course, if you want to find out about any of our future events, you can follow us on all the social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And for now, I think we are going to have that 5-minute break, and I hope you all enjoy the biodiversity quiz that I put together earlier. So see you soon. Hi everyone, welcome back. So we've had a few questions coming in for Rike, so we'll just dive straight in. Firstly, thank you for the great talk. It's gone down well. People are very much appreciating it. So the first question we had coming in, when classifying a species extinction being prevented, was there a population threshold that you used to determine the prevented or not?
No, there wasn't, and that's because there's sort of really two key things. So there's population size, but there is also the change in the population size. So originally, for example, we included some vulture species that had very large populations, over 10,000, I think, but they declined extremely rapidly. And so you can't just look at the number, but you also have to look at how that number has been changing. And we did, I don't think I mentioned this during the talk, but we did actually also include species that are extinct in the wild. So that means there are no individuals left in the wild, but there are some left in zoos or in botanical collections. I guess would be for plants. Obviously, we didn't do that for plants, but you could extend to plants and say anything that's in collections or in zoos. Because by definition, if we hadn't put them in a zoo, that species would be gone altogether. Of course, they're a bit of a different case. But yeah, so we didn't have a population threshold as such.
Yeah, because I suppose it's a difficult one to do because depending on the species, I don't know if you've seen an article I was reading today about a bird species, a honey eater in Australia. The idea that I think the males of that species learn their mating call from other males, and the population has gotten so small that the males are now not able to learn this call because there's not enough individuals around. And that's obviously a threshold. The population isn't extinct yet, but if those birds aren't able to attract mates, they're not able to learn the song, attract the mates, then that's going to have a really big impact. So for each species, I guess it's very different what will affect it and what won't.
Yeah, that's right. And it also depends on how long they live, actually, because some species, we could have included if we looked over a longer time frame, but because it was only, I guess, since 93, so not that long, and some very long-lived species we excluded because they wouldn't have gone extinct over that time period. But probably if it had been 50 years, they maybe would have been included. So yeah, so lots of things to consider. But for the IUCN Red List, actually, there are sort of different thresholds for these different categories. So for that, it is relevant.
Did you include anything about the sort of species in its habitat related to other species? So, for example, with the Iberian lynx, presumably it's a big mammal. It has quite a large range. It has prey species. So if that went extinct, that would have a knock-on effect with the other species in that area. Was that counted? Did some species, the likelihood of extinction of any particular species made it more likely for 10, 20 others?
So not specifically, but actually the Iberian lynx is a good example because the prey, the rabbit population, if that did go extinct, for example, then that would probably have a knock-on effect on the Iberian lynx. So, so that's the worry there. So in some cases you get that, but mostly it's kind of the other way around, and it's about the invasive species. And if you can remove them, then the native species might bounce back. But yeah, so it's a bit of a funny one. But actually, yeah, Iberian lynx probably the best example of all the species we have
Yeah.
because of that strong link.
Yeah, there's so many links when you think about it. Trying to track just one, it's never going to be in isolation. There's always going to be an effect, and just understanding what that effect will be is very
Yeah,
difficult, I'd imagine.
yeah, absolutely.
So another question from the audience we have: what is the most effective thing that we as individuals can do? Are there things we can do to put pressure on the governments?
That's a really good question. I mean, if we're talking generally, I would say that what you buy and what you eat does make a difference. This is not some sort of call for everyone to turn vegan, absolutely not. But of course, if you eat a lot of animal products, you need more land to produce the same number of calories, essentially. So that is something you could do if that's what you're interested in. But actually, what I think is maybe even more effective is reducing your food waste. And a good way to do that is by doing meal planning. So if you actually plan your week and you plan what you're going to eat, and then you go to the shop and buy the stuff for that, you're going to probably waste less food, or at least that's what the studies suggest that I've read. That's absolutely not my area of research, but it's all connected. And I think that's such an important one because, of course, you save some money and you're doing something good for biodiversity and also for the climate. In terms of lobbying governments, I mean, that's absolutely something you can try. There are, of course, lots of organizations that do that as well. So there are different ones. I mean, IUCN is the one I mentioned a lot. There are, of course, different charities that do a lot of this work. So in particular, BirdLife, I guess, for birds, they do a lot of work around that, for example. But, there are different charities that you might get involved with. But yeah, I guess you could try and write to your MP. I've written to my MP about biodiversity issues before, but I don't know how many other people do that.
Did you get a response?
Oh yeah, you get a proper official letterhead and all. It's very proper. Yeah.
Oh no, I hope it's not a waste of paper. I must admit, I do meal planning, and it gives you an incredible sense of superiority when you stood in Lidl with your little list. Oh, aren't I great? Or is that just me? It might just be me.
Yeah, we have phases of doing it better, and it is really good because also you don't need to think after a long day of work of, oh God, what am I going to cook? But you already know or have an idea of what you're going to cook. But we're not as strict with it as we should be. But yeah, so there you go. We're all just human.
Do you think so? Obviously, you mentioned the positives of this, that this work shows potentially, quite likely, species extinctions have been prevented by the conservation efforts that have been put into action. Do you think that will help future efforts? Do you think it's going to help? You could actually have this evidence that these examples we can point to and say, look, this does work. Do you think that's going to help people in future to get more on board and believe it can make a change?
I mean, I really hope so because, there is a lot of doom and gloom in the news because, it really, that's how the situation is. So I think if we can have these positive stories to, I guess to inspire people and to sort of galvanize action, I think that's really beneficial. I mean, also as a kind of proof of concept, we can do it. It's not easy and it does require a lot of work. And I guess ideally we should get to a point where species aren't ever that close to extinction, where we actually need to do all of this really intensive conservation action. But yeah, I mean, I really hope so that it can make a bit of a difference. And yeah, that hopefully people feel inspired by it and ask good questions like people have been here. So that's really good.
Yeah, I think so. So you mentioned obviously these targets were very ambitious. As you said, they need to be, that we need this change to happen. Presumably that feeds into the fact that none of the targets, the previous targets, were met. Mm-hmm. Do you think that's the way to go? Do you think the future targets that they're going to set this year or next year, do you think they need to be scaled down a bit so we can achieve more of them? Or do you think it just comes with the territory? They have to be ambitious and the risk there is that none of them are going to be met.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think it's a very fine balance. Because yes, they should be ambitious ideally, but if they are so, unattainable essentially, that countries are just like, well, there is just no way we can do any of this. Of course, that's not useful either. So I think they should be as ambitious as possible, while still being realistic. But I think we shouldn't sort of stop there and think, okay, we've got the targets now and that's it. But actually thinking about, how can we actually achieve some of this? And I think there is a lot of great work being done now to try and look at some of that. But of course, it requires a lot of political will and also a lot of change. So, which may or may not be realistic. But then, equally last year, you went to the shops and they were empty. And I went to the little shop in my village and they still had, tin tomatoes and pasta, which had sold out everywhere in the big supermarkets. And so I think, we have learned that if it has to, the world can change very dramatically at very short notice. And obviously, we're not saying that all of that kind of thing needs to carry on or whatever. But I think we know now that if we have to, we can change. And in some way, I think we can learn from that. Obviously, not from all the negatives that come with that, ideally. But yeah, so who knows? I mean, I think as a bit of a proof of concept that we can change things if we really have to. Maybe it's interesting, but also maybe it's just a bit of blue sky thinking.
Honestly, the empty shelves versus my meal planning. Oh, that's a heartbreak, a very, very bitter heartbreak there.
Yeah.
One thing I was intrigued about, so this whole project, it's the scale of it. So you mentioned you got 30 experts that had to give independent reviews of these species, and then you had to get them together to discuss to see if they wanted to change their mind. How did you manage that logistically?
Lots of spreadsheets and being very organized and also very upfront with people and deadlines, and then working very hard to try and stick to them. So we did a lot of this work actually before the pandemic hit. And because the experts were sort of all over the world, we actually used Zoom to have these discussions, which was sort of funny because then in March, suddenly everyone knew what Zoom was. I'd never heard of Zoom before we did any of these workshops, but I did literally have spreadsheets of everyone and had they sent me their scores and which call were they going to go to, because of all the different time zones, we couldn't get everyone onto the same call. And some people had to be up in the middle of the night to attend, which must have been pretty horrible for them. But they did it anyway, which was amazing. And yeah, so that's how I did that. So I just basically had to keep track of everyone on spreadsheets, and most of the people, I didn't know them beforehand. So a lot of that sort of input came from other people who'd kind of thought of the project originally. I should have mentioned really, mainly from BirdLife. And so I had sort of all of these names and I didn't really know who people were necessarily. And so I definitely had to keep spreadsheets to keep track and then be very clear in my emails. I need this by this date, and then of course give people a few more days because they never send everything in on time and so on. But yeah, it was quite stressful at times to keep track of it all. But yeah, we've managed somehow, and yeah, probably a good thing it all was pretty much done and dusted before the pandemic hit, because that would have been very difficult, I think, doing all of that from sort of the isolation of my little spare room office. So
yeah. But it's very impressive. I can barely manage my own time, let alone getting 30 people to agree on something. Wow. So changing tact a little bit, obviously the pandemic, a big thing we're all very aware of now. Do you think actually, so people being in lockdown, having to stay in their houses, I've noticed a lot more people really getting out there and appreciating their local nature because there was nothing else to do. Do you think that might have had a positive influence on work like this about particularly species conservation? Do you think people are more likely to take notice?
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, I know I certainly did last year, I guess, particularly because around March is when a lot of things sort of come to life again. And I kind of brushed up a bit on my not very good wildflower ID because, we did our daily exercise, and I would, look at what's in flower now. Don't know if anyone knows the app called Seek by iNaturalist, I think it is. So you can scan different species, and it tries to identify to species level. It's great stuff, actually. It uses sort of machine learning to identify what different things are. Works good for plants, works less good for animal species in general, I think. But yeah, so that's quite a good one. So I think it probably has had an impact on people, and also just realizing how important it is. I'm sure people who live in Newcastle or in any of the other cities, I guess, in the Northeast, have really realized, if you're sort of stuck and you can just go to your local park, and then everyone is there, it's quite difficult. Of course, it's a bit easier if you live in a village and you have access maybe to more countryside more easily. But yeah, I think there is this move now, isn't there, that people move away from city centers. So yeah, who knows? I mean, I think it probably will have an impact. But yeah, hopefully, yeah, people will realize how nice it is and how important it is for your mental health, I guess, as well, to be outside and experience all that.
Yeah, definitely. I really got into bird spotting in my garden. I was hoping to do it again this year, but in the end of the summer, I got a very active border collie, and now I've not seen a single bird in my garden since. So I no longer know what birds look like, to be honest. But you'll know all about that. Obviously, you have just adopted a beautiful border collie puppy. I mean, I'm not going to lie, I was really hoping she'd make an appearance, but it's
Yeah, I'm
okay.
kind of hoping she's sleeping now because it's kind of her bedtime, and she turns into a bit of a monster if she doesn't get her sleep in. But yeah, yeah,
Oh,
she doesn't look like
she'll
it,
always
but
be like that. She will always be like that. I've
yeah.
just got one last question, very important one. Do you have a favorite endangered species?
Um, that's a good question. It's funny actually because my favorite species isn't actually endangered. So I'll quickly tell you about that, and then I'll think of an endangered one. Um, so my favorite one is probably a bird called a dipper, which is a songbird, but they feed underwater, so they can swim as well. So they're quite unique in that, and they are fantastic birds. And you'll see them in the Northeast. You'll see them in sort of on upland streams if you go up to Northumberland. Once it's allowed, obviously, not now, but once you're allowed to go up again and maybe go to the Cogan Valley or something, you probably see them there in other bits, or in on the Derwent Valley in Gateshead, you can see them there as well, for example. Anyway, so that's probably my favorite species. My favorite endangered one, maybe I pick one that was part of our study, and it's the only one of all of those species I've ever seen, because I'm not particularly well traveled, and most of these species are obviously in sort of far-flung places. And that one is called the Bald Ibis. So you should look that one up. It's really not the prettiest species, but it's the only one of the ones that we studied that I've actually seen. And if you go again, once it's allowed, if you ever go to the south of Spain, you can see them there, and they just sort of sit on this rock ledge, and you can just sort of drive by, and there are all these big ibises sort of just sat by the side of the road, and they're they're an endangered species, but they just sort of sit there, and you can basically watch them from your car. So it's very easy bird watching. But yeah, they're quite. But yeah, you should definitely look them up because they look quite funny.
Excellent. Well, thank you. What work are you doing now? Are you continuing with this same theme?
Yeah, kind of. So this work that I presented at the end, that's hopefully going to get published at some point. So we're still working on that. I've got some changes to make on that. And yeah, I'm kind of interested really more in this sort of this broader question of how, what do we actually need to change? What are the underlying drivers of biodiversity loss? So I think I'm going to move a little bit more into that direction rather than sort of more species focused like I have been doing. So yeah, I think it's a really exciting sort of research topic, and I think it's also really needed, so we know at least how we can fix things, and somehow then implement this challenging part.
Definitely, that's great. Well, if you have any exciting breakthroughs, we would, of course, be happy to share them. But thank you so much for your talk. It was really great. Great to hear about particularly the positives that have come out of this. As you're right, we do need some positives at the moment. So for all of our audience, thank you for joining us. As I said earlier, our next CyberSciBar is on the 21st of April. That is Professor Chris Greenwell from the University of Durham. And there is another CyberSciBar in May, the 19th of May. If you want to watch tonight's talk back again, then you can do. We'll be putting it up onto the Palace of Science YouTube channel, and it will also be available on Twitch to stream. And of course, if you want to follow any of our future events, you can follow us on all social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. If you have any questions or comments, then please comment on our Palace of Science webpage. And I think that's everything from me. So thank you for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you in April.